have seen that sometimes biblical authors use narrative or storytelling to communicate important theological truths. These truths are not limited to questions about how people should conduct themselves, but also include important theological concepts. That means that if we're going to understand how these teachings are communicated in the Bible, we must learn how to read biblical narratives intelligently. And if we're going to read biblical narratives intelligently, we need to understand how narratives work. So, how does narrative work? The first thing that we must understand, and we discussed this in the previous segment, is that all storytelling, whether history or fiction, involves the selection and arrangement of material that the author judges will help the reader understand what happens, why it happens, and the significance of its happening. The second thing that we need to understand about narrative is that narrative is more than simply a report of something that happened. For example, if I were to tell you that yesterday I went to the grocery store and bought some bread and meat and cheese and then came home and made myself a sandwich, that would be a report of something that happened. But it would not be a narrative in the literary sense. The difference is this: a report is the recounting of something that happened, whether real or fictional. A narrative strings together multiple reports in such a way as to show the relationship between them. To put it another way, a report focuses on what happened. A narrative focuses on why it happened, or on the meaning or significance of what has happened. Fundamentally, a narrative is about change. It may be a change that happens to a single character in the story, or it may be a change that happens to the circumstances of the whole world. But revealing what changes, and why it changes, and what the change means, that's the essence of narrative. For it's in understanding the change that the reader comes to understand the significance of what happened. The third thing we need to understand about narrative is how a narrative is constructed. To be sure, not all narratives are the same. Different types of narratives can have different structures. But the most common type of narrative, the type of narrative that we most frequently encounter in the Bible, has 5 main parts. And we need to understand those parts and the relations to one another. The first part of a narrative is the scene setting. Sometimes literary types refer to this element of the narrative using a French phrase, the mise en scène. Others call it simply the exposition. Whatever it may be called, the scene-setting element in a narrative establishes the situation at the beginning of the narrative, what we might call the status quo ante. This is important to a narrative because for the reader to understand the significance of what happens, he has to be able to see how the circumstances of the people change from what they were at the start to what they become at the end. So the general goal of the scene-setting portion of a narrative is to establish the starting point, most often by introducing some of the key characters and describing their circumstances. The narrative can establish the setting in a number of ways. It can do this by recounting a scene that paints a picture of the situation as it exists at the beginning of the narrative. It can do this through a conversation in which the situation is revealed. Or it can do it by giving a summary statement of recent events or of the state of things in general as the narrative begins. And of course, it can sometimes use a combination of all of these. Another thing that often happens in the scene-setting phase of a narrative is that the author establishes the trajectory of the narrative by introducing the basic conflict around which the narrative will develop as it moves forward. Most narratives have some sort of scene-setting element, though it's not always at the very beginning of the story. Sometimes, for example, an author will jump right into things and later backfill by revealing the status quo ante as the story unfolds. When this happens, we say that a narrative begins in media res, in the middle of things. But most narratives have some sort of scene setting or mise en scène at or near the beginning of the narrative. The second main part of a narrative is the conflict stage. Sometimes this is called the rising action. This is typically the longest part of the narrative. It's made up of one or more scenes, usually many scenes, in which things happen to the main characters. The things that happen put the characters under stress, and that stress reveals their strengths and weaknesses, and also shows how they change as the narrative develops. The things that happen in the conflict stage also introduce changes in the situation. Most of the time, this comes about through events or encounters between characters that produce conflict. And it's this conflict that places the characters under stress and brings about change. In addition to bringing about change that places characters under stress, often the conflict stage of a narrative will contain attempts to resolve the conflict that fail. These failed attempts to resolve the conflict are an important part of the narrative. They heighten the tension further and contribute much to our understanding of the characters. But they also set the stage for the culmination that will eventually successfully resolve the tension that is gradually built up over the course of the conflict phase of the narrative. The failed solutions help the reader understand the meaning of the narrative by revealing why they failed and thereby showing why the eventual successful resolution works. This brings us to the third main part of the narrative, known as the crisis or the climax, or sometimes in psychological terms as the catharsis of the narrative. The crisis is the point in the narrative when matters come to a head, when something happens to bring about the major change in the situation that resolves or starts to resolve the conflict that has been building up. This may be a change in understanding on the part of one of the characters, or it may be a fundamental change in the circumstances of a character or group of characters. Another way to think about the catharsis is to recognize that it is often the moment of transition, the turning point, the instant in which the major change takes place. However it comes about, the crisis is the point in the narrative when the focus of the narrative shifts from building up tension through conflict to resolving or releasing that tension as a result of some change that has taken place. The fourth main part of a narrative is the resolution phase. This part of the narrative is sometimes called the denouement, using the French term, or the falling action of the narrative. The denouement, or falling action, is the antithesis of the conflict stage of the narrative. If we think of the conflict stage of the narrative in terms of the winding up of tension, then in the resolution phase, that tension begins to unwind as the implications of the climax become increasingly apparent. This can happen gradually over several scenes, or it can happen very quickly. If it happens gradually, then the narrative usually contains further events or further conversations in which the difference produced by the crisis is demonstrated in the actions or the attitudes of the central characters. If it happens quickly, the denouement can be reduced to as much as a summary sentence, or in some cases it can actually be omitted altogether, particularly when the narrative jumps immediately or suddenly from the crisis to the ending. And that brings us to the fifth and last main part of a narrative, the closing situation, sometimes called the resolution, or more simply, the ending. This is the bookend to the mise en scène, or scene setting, at the beginning. It presents us with the situation at the end of the sequence of events, after the crisis has brought about the major change in the circumstances, so that we can see what has changed as a result of what happened. At this point, if the narrator has done his job well, and if we readers have done our jobs well, then we will understand not only what happened, but why it happened, and most important of all, the meaning or significance of what has happened. It's important to remember that not all narratives will have all five of these parts. For example, sometimes the falling action, or the denouement, and the closing situation, or the resolution, are abbreviated or folded into one. And sometimes parts are omitted altogether or rearranged. So far, we've talked about three things that we need to understand about narratives: the importance of selection and arrangement, the fact that a narrative is more than a report of what happened, and the importance of understanding the five main parts of the most common type of narrative. The fourth and last thing that we need to understand about narrative is that long and complex narratives are commonly comprised of smaller narrative units. We typically refer to these smaller narrative units, the building blocks of narrative, as scenes. In addition to individual scenes, many complex narratives have secondary storylines that run alongside the main trajectory of the story. We commonly call these secondary storylines subplots. Subplots may deal with a certain character from a larger group. They may resolve smaller conflicts that in turn contribute to the greater story. One way to understand these elements is by using the analogy of a war. A war is made up of lots of small battles, and each of these battles is in turn comprised of the individual struggles of the many soldiers who fight in them. Each soldier's individual struggle comes together to make up the story of a battle, and each battle is its own story. But collectively, all of the individual battles, the subplots, if you will, of the narrative of the war as a whole, All of these work together to tell the story of how the war was won or lost. To get back to narrative. In the case of narrative, it's important to recognize the individual scenes and subplots for what they are, and to identify how they relate to other scenes and other subplots, and how they come together to build up the whole narrative. If we fail to do this, we can possibly misunderstand the message of the whole, or draw the wrong conclusion about the significance of a particular event. So, knowing how narratives work is crucial to reading them and understanding the message that the author is attempting to communicate. In this segment, we've looked at how narratives are put together. In the next segment, we'll consider what we should look for as we read a narrative.